Good morning and welcome to Mountain Strong. Today we are not on a mountain, but we're actually in our nation's capital. Our family's had a pretty interesting couple of weeks. We were in Juneau, Alaska for the statewide lectureship, and last week we came back from that on Tuesday. We met with the saints at our congregation in South Anchorage on Wednesday, and then on Thursday we were back on a plane. My wife spoke at a ladies' day in Carlisle, Pennsylvania this past Saturday, and on Sunday I was speaking in Levittown, Pennsylvania, and then here we are now in the nation's capital. My wife had to get her passport renewed, and so we thought we'd go and see the Australian embassy here, but spend a couple of days and see a couple of other things as well before heading back to Anchorage, Alaska. Now, today we're going to be doing what we do on Mountain Strong, which is to examine the Psalms, but it's not altogether inappropriate that we're doing so here in our nation's capital, because when we think about the Old Testament point of view, governments were often described as being mountains, and so it's appropriate that we examine a psalm from the mountain of the United States, the capital of the United States, here in Washington, D.C. Let's go ahead and read the psalm together. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills His purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out His steadfast love and His faithfulness. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. For your steadfast love is great to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. As I think about the words of this psalm, it's not altogether inappropriate that we're having a look at this psalm here in the nation's capital. And the reason is because what I saw in verse 4, where it says, the children of man whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. And I think about the situation currently surrounding the righteous here in the United States of America. It's the situation where we are surrounded by men whose teeth are biting into us, their spears and arrows against us. The righteous are being spoken against everywhere as people try to pronounce their rights and try to push forward their rights. The rights of Christians are being pushed down and being repressed, and it seems as though everyone can have free speech except for Christians these days. But I'm still thankful to live in the United States, still thankful to be able to speak freely. And while I can do so, it's important that I speak messages of faithfulness. And this is a wonderful and beautiful message of faithfulness here in Psalm 57. You see, what this psalm shows us is an example of someone who is engaging a struggle from the standpoint of faith. We've seen in the Psalms before how maybe there's a psalm where there's total struggle from beginning to end. There doesn't seem to be any solution to the psalmist's problems. And then there are those psalms where the psalmist moves from a position of struggle to a position of faith, where the psalmist gives that struggle over to God. But in this psalm, we see an example of someone who is engaging his struggle continually through faith. Let me show you what I'm talking about. In verse number 1, notice how he says, be merciful. And so there's a call out to God to be merciful. He cries out to God in verse 2. Why is he doing so? Because in verse 3, he feels trampled upon. In verse 4, he feels as though he's surrounded by lions, by fiery beasts, by men and their words and their deeds, their arrows coming and attacking him, their tongues being sharp swords against him. In verse 6, he even sees where these people are plotting against him. But how does all that make him feel? Well, he feels secure even though all of these things are happening to him. He says, be merciful to me, O God, but he says that and then says in verse 1 that he rests in the shadow of the wings of God during storms. What a beautiful picture. I think about that song that we sometimes sing, till the storm passes over. And no better place is there to be in the midst of a storm than in the wings of God. We got caught in a rainstorm on Sunday, and we were using a very small umbrella to try to protect our family, and it didn't offer much protection. But as I think about the umbrella, so to speak, of the wings of God, there is enough room for everyone to find protection, and the protection they find there is total protection. It's a beautiful picture. The psalmist says in verse number 2 that he cries out to God, but he cries out to God knowing that God has a purpose for this moment. I love that statement in verse 2, to God who fulfills His purpose for me. When we engage our struggles from the standpoint that there is a purpose for this, it might not be that we know the individual purpose for this moment, but that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. When we know that from the beginning of our struggle, it helps us to engage our struggle and do so successfully. He cries out to God because he feels trampled upon, yes, in verse 3, but he knows that God is going to put to shame the one who is trampling upon him in verse 3, that God is going to send out His steadfast love and His faithfulness. He says, yeah, I'm surrounded by lions and fiery beasts in verse 4, but notice how that doesn't stop him in verse 5 from offering praise to God, from saying, be exalted, O God, above the heavens, and let your glory be over all the earth. In verse 6, there are people who are plotting against him. They've dug a pit, so to speak, for him, but he says they're the ones who are going to fall into that pit. Now, what is it going to take to have this kind of faithfulness? What is it going to take to be able to be this secure in the storms of life? Well, God offers this security, and even in those psalms where there is struggling and that struggling continues till the end of the psalm, don't forget the fact that even though the psalmist might be struggling, the reality is that God's wings are still extended and that God is still looking over him and caring for him. But I'd rather than engage in my struggle thinking that I'm going to fail and worrying about it, I'd rather feel like the psalmist does here in verse 57. So how am I going to get like that? Well, there are at least 3 suggestions from this psalm that I want us to consider. First of all, I want us to notice how, in the midst of all of this, how the psalmist pauses. If we're going to have this kind of faith, it will require us to pause, to stop, to engage the moment rather than letting the moment overtake us. Notice how he says in verse 3, He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. That statement of faith flows out, and he has to pause to catch it, to say, okay, this is real, this is genuine, this is important, that God is going to send out His steadfast love. And then he talks about the pit, but then he says they're going to fall into the pit. And then once again he pauses. The statement of faith that comes out of his lips, he has to catch it. He has to hold on to it. He has to engage the moment from the standpoint of that faith. Hold on to the truth more than he holds on to the lies of those whose tongues are against him, he says in verse number 4. And so it requires us, if we're going to develop faithfulness, it requires us to pause. But it also requires persistence. Notice in verse 7 he says, my heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. You don't get this kind of faith overnight. You know, in Romans chapter 5, when Paul talks about how trials can work something better in us, can produce hope in us, in order for them to do so, they have to be engaged with patience. Patience breeds experience, and experience breeds hope. And so if we do not engage our struggles with patience, if we give up the moment that the struggle happens, we can never be able to look back and see the glory of our God. I was talking with a brother on Sunday, and we were talking about our stories and how he had come to Christ and how my life had developed, and he made the point that you can really see the hand of God better when you're looking backward than when you're looking forward. Well, you can only see the hand of God when you look backward, if you've allowed your life to be led by that hand. And so it requires persistence. But then number 3, it requires praise. It requires praise. In verses 8 through 11, notice how after all of these faithful statements, notice how his heart pours forth in praise to God. I like the marginal reading there in verse 8 where it says, instead of awake my glory, it says, awake my whole being. My whole being has to awake and give praise to God. And if we give praise to God properly, then we awake the dawn. We cause light to shine where there is none. We cause other people to see the glory of God. And he says that in verse 9. He says, I will sing praises to you among the nations. Everyone's going to know about who you are when I finish speaking about how great you are. This is a far cry from us when we go to church services and maybe we don't sing because we don't think we have a good singing voice, or we don't sing very loudly because we're scared of what people might think. When we pour forth our hearts in praises to God, people hear and people know. And when we do so, we encourage ourselves and them to be faithful to our God. And so again, three things to have the kind of faith we see in this psalm. It requires us to pause, it requires patience, and it requires praise. And I hope that those three things will be helpful to you, and I hope you have a blessed day.